Dream of the Red Chamber is the most famous piece of long-form Chinese fiction. It's also pretty intimidating. The cast of characters alone stretches into the hundreds, and there are a lot of cultural assumptions that can be challenging for readers unfamiliar with the world of China in the 18th century. But it's not as hard to understand as you might think. In fact, if you're an intermediate to maybe a low advanced student of Chinese, you probably have the linguistic background that you need to at least begin to understand the novel, even if you don't believe it. When I talk about learning how to read Dream of the Red Chamber, I'm really referring to two different things. You've got the surface level of understanding, which is figuring out what the Chinese characters actually mean. And then you've got the deeper level of understanding, which is figuring out what in the world is going on. Now, I don't want to make you think that I'm like the expert in the whole world on either one of those subjects. I'm not. I'm a student of this book just like the rest of you. But I do want to give you at least a few pieces of advice for how you can approach this book, things that you can do to go from barely understanding the novel to becoming maybe even some sort of expert. Okay, first off, let's talk about the language problem. The language of Dream of the Red Chamber is actually more approachable than you think. There are a few passages that will give you some trouble, especially if you don't have a strong background in classical Chinese. But to tell you a little secret, classical Chinese really isn't all that scary. It's kind of overrated. It's not like classical Greek where you have to keep a whole bunch of different archaic verb conjugations in mind all the time or worry about different endings or whatever. When you start to get the hang of classical Chinese, it becomes easier and easier. Well, classical Chinese grammar is largely driven by sentence particles like zhi, hu, zhe, and ye. In general terms, zhi is usually a possessive particle, which is similar to the modern de. Hu is usually a question particle, which is similar to the modern ma. Zhe takes things that are not nouns and turns them into nouns. It's actually used the same way in modern Chinese. And ye at the end of the sentence is what we call a copula. It's the old version of the verb to be. There's also this kind of nasty concept known as a topic comment sentence that happens in classical Chinese like all the time. But honestly, if you're familiar with modern Chinese, you've probably already seen this. You'll notice that Chinese sentences will sometimes take the topic and stick it up to the front. This is actually pretty common in colloquial sentences. And if you speak Korean, you know all about this because it literally happens all the time. The same is true of Japanese, and it all comes originally from classical Chinese. Now, you don't need to be an expert in classical Chinese to read Dream of the Red Chamber. In fact, if you study a ton of classical Chinese first and then come to the book, you're going to be disappointed. It's helpful to have a little bit of familiarity, but the basics are really good enough. The reason why is because the book is largely written in colloquial Chinese, not in the ancient stuff. This is more or less true of all the famous novels of Imperial China, though it's especially true of Dream of the Red Chamber. However, Dream of the Red Chamber is different because the characters tend to speak in a version of the language that seems very modern. Well, almost all the characters speak that way. Sometimes people like Jia Yucun will speak in a pretentious style that is kind of funny when you understand how the language register works. The bigger problem that you're going to have is with specialty words, and thanks to the internet, that's really not that big of a deal. So, come across a word you've never seen before? Easy, stick it in Google and figure it out. I recommend reading an online version of the novel or having one handy if you want to read a printed version of the book. It's easy to copy and paste into a search engine. Now, most of your results are going to be in Chinese, which can be daunting at first. But if you don't understand the results, you can still translate them using some free tools. And if all else fails, you can always use AI. Well, if you're going to use AI to help you out, I strongly recommend using DeepSeek for anything that's Chinese. DeepSeek seems to understand Chinese better than any of the other chatbots. However, you don't want to just take sentences, stick them in, and have them translate them for you. I recommend asking a lot of questions. Ask the AI about how the grammar works, ask it about what certain words mean, and so on. Sometimes you'll catch it hallucinating. Actually, you'll frequently catch it hallucinating if you ask questions and if you're persistent. The bigger question, though, is how in the world you can remember all the stuff you learn. If you read every single day, pretty soon you'll start picking up on the patterns. But not all of us have time to read every single day, and that's why we've got this thing called spatial repetition software. Like most others, I strongly recommend giving Anki a whirl. Anki can be intimidating at first, but it's not too bad once you get the hang of it. So my personal Anki decks are focused around training my listening, reading, speaking, and writing abilities, and that includes handwriting. By the way, you also really want to practice writing Chinese characters by hand. I know that a lot of you don't want to hear this, but it really is true. You kind of want those characters to become a part of you, which means that you need to learn them backwards and forwards. And you know what? If native speakers of the language in China and Taiwan spend hours practicing writing, you probably should do it too. Well, make sure that you learn phrases and sentences too, not just individual words. I'll show you my trick for learning grammar, which works really well with particles. Simply mark the particle in bold and create cards to test yourself only on what the particle itself means. This will help you learn specialized particle meanings and grammatical forms in the context of the sentence rather than trying to remember it all completely abstractly. Well, context matters a lot. All languages really are contextual in one way or another, but Chinese and the other East Asian languages are especially heavy in the contextual type of communication. And speaking of context, this leads us to the bigger problem you'll have when you try to read this book, figuring out what in the world Cao Shui-Qin is talking about. About a decade ago, I tried seriously reading Dream of the Red Chamber for the first time. I read the Chinese original alongside the two English translations. I was really surprised at how frequently the translations contradicted each other. Sometimes the Chinese original felt like a completely different book. I also found myself frequently frustrated by cryptic passages with no clue as to what they meant. Actually, it's kind of a good thing to feel frustrated with this book. It means that you actually care and that you're paying attention. Anybody can just, flip through the book really quickly and claim to have read it in record time. It's a lot more meaningful if you read it slowly, and remember to always ask why. When Cao Shui-Qin writes what seems like a random passage unrelated to what just happened, you need to ask yourself why. When Cao Shui-Qin uses a specific unusual phrase to describe a character, you really should ask yourself why. When the characters do strange things like Jia Baoyu smashing his jade on the ground when he realizes that Lin Dayu doesn't have one, you really should ask yourself why in the world he would do that. Now, you can do Google searches for some of these things and you'll find the answers that others have thought of. And you can also ask DeepSeek or another AI bot for help, and it might give you a scholarly valid answer, although your mileage may vary. You could even spend hours reading what other scholars have said about the book. But the most important thing you can do is form your own opinions as to what is happening. You see, we can spend hours and hours reading what scholars think. We can spend a lot of time digging into contemporary works of fiction. We can spend a lot of time learning about news events from the past. We could even do crazy linguistic tricks to try to prove this thing or that thing or whatever. But that's not really the most important point of literary interpretation. No, the most important thing is what you think. And the truth is that a lot of the things that scholars say may not actually be all that accurate, or sometimes might really not be relevant. But we have this unfortunate tendency of treating the past as some mystic place that is impossible to understand. Now, it is true that China in the mid-18th century was a very different place than the modern world. However, the characters, or the people described in this book, are people just like you and me. In fact, their humanity, their strengths and weaknesses, their hopes and fears, their love and loathing, and their triumph and frustration, describing all of that in a relatable manner is actually the main point of the book. And the thing is, when you start realizing that you can identify with the characters, the book takes on a whole new meaning. It turns from some sort of our academic work that people say is important that you have to read to pass some class at school into something that actually speaks directly to you and that implicates our world today. There really is a lot in this book that relates directly to today's world, and there's a lot of this stuff that we should keep in mind. For example, Jia Yucun blames the violent murder of Feng Yuan on fate, as if karma were responsible instead of the murderer Shui Pan. When Zhen Shirin renounces the world and leaves his wife behind at the end of the first chapter, we don't follow him on his journey. Instead, we feel the pain that his wife felt. And it's not just that Jia Baoyu feels upset at the rules that he faces at home. He's actually upset at the pressure he feels, the pressure to always succeed, the pressure to be the chosen one to save the family. It's a feeling a surprising number of young people can relate to today. Now, the thing is, this requires kind of a balancing act. I mean, you do need to make sure that you actually understand the original text. Once upon a time, I had a literary teacher who said, "Oh, just try to learn, what this Chinese phrase or word means in context." That doesn't work. You have to use a dictionary, you have to use the internet, you have to look stuff up. But, by the same token, it's also important not to restrict yourself to only a single interpretation of what the text actually means. Anyway, come along with me on this journey. We'll read the book together and we'll see if we can't come up with our own interpretation of the book. Maybe one for me and one for you if we want to disagree. And the thing is, we're going to go slowly so that we don't get overwhelmed.